This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Prime lenses are a fantastic way to improve your photography skill and overall have a more minimal and a simple approach to photography. However, just like anything, there are certain mistakes that will hinder our experience shooting with these lenses. And believe me, everything I'm about to talk about I've done many times. As a matter of fact, the biggest mistake that I'm going to share with you at the end of the video actually happened in Lisbon, which was only a couple of weeks ago, and that was the catalyst for this video. Oh, and by the way, if you didn't watch that POV, I do highly recommend it. It's probably my best POV photography video to date. The vast majority of us started out using zoom lenses, especially the kit zooms that came with our cameras. So we got used to the fact that we can just zoom in and out and change our composition without having to move ourselves. And I think over time, that practice has become almost ingrained in our subconscious when we're taking photos. So naturally, when we progress towards prime lenses, we tend to not move around. We'll still stay still. And even if we did move around, it'll literally be 1 or 2 steps forwards and backwards just to get everything in the frame. In my opinion, to get the most out of prime lenses, you really need to move around. Not only do you want to move forwards and backwards or effectively zoom with your feet, but you also want to change perspective. So if you're shooting something, rather than just having it at, standard angle, go back and forth, maybe raise the camera, lower the camera, or even find something else to shoot through because you do have that option. And whilst you're moving around, you want to keep an eye on your composition and just see how all of these different angles and different combinations change your perspective and change the image that you get at the end. Make this approach a habit every time you go to take a photo. Sure, there'll be certain scenarios where you physically can't do that, or where a standard sort of point and shoot approach is the best one. But as much as possible, do try and move around and, don't constrain yourself to just what you see. Because at the end of the day, when you come home, you got your 10, 20 photos from your day, from your trip, whatever. It's so refreshing to see different perspectives of the particular location or the place or the subject you were shooting. And when you put it all into let's say a photo collection, then it just creates a more dynamic image set. To piggyback onto this topic, I also want to add that maybe previously when you had your big zoom lens, you were intimidated to go to certain locations where maybe you were closer to other people, or even locations where maybe security can kick you out because you look like you have a pro camera. Well, now you have a small prime, maybe you can try those locations again. Equally, when you did have your big zoom lens, maybe after 5 miles of walking around, you were knackered, you had enough. And now that you've got less weight, perhaps you want to extend that 5-mile walk to a 10-mile walk, take a route that you've never taken before, or even retrace the same route you've walked the other way to get a new perspective on your route. Just because your prime goes down to f1.4 doesn't mean that every photo you take should be at the aperture. When I first started out in photography and I had my first prime, which was a Canon 50mm 1.8, I'm pretty sure I super glued it to 1.8 because in my opinion, I paid money for a 1.8 lens. So using it at f4 or f8 or any other aperture other than f1.8 was somehow not getting my money's worth, which obviously saying that now makes me sound like a complete bellend. But when I started out, that's how I thought. And I think a lot of people think like that, at least subconsciously anyway. I personally think that not utilizing other aperture values can hinder your photography, as I'll show you right now. So with me personally, I either shoot wide open, which I know contradicts, but hear me out, or I will stop down to anywhere between f4, f5.6, all the way down to f11 if need be. Shooting wide open only happens in certain specific situations, such as when you have very low light, when I need to prioritize a high shutter speed to catch a moving subject and freeze it, when I want to get the softest possible image because lenses typically are at their softest when they are wide open, when I need to completely blur out the background for a specific purpose. Obviously, this is a very slippery slope. You can go from something tasteful to something that belongs on a sick tones Instagram share page really quickly, so do exercise caution and restraint. And finally, when the amount of blur in the out of focus elements of the image is realistic for the scene. You might be a bit confused about that one, however, I'll come back to that, so hold it in your mind for now. As for stopping the lens down to anywhere between f5.6 to f8, I'll typically do this when there is ample light or there's actually quite a lot of light coming in that I need to control. When I want the best performance out the lens in terms of sharpness and detail, which on most lenses will typically be between around f8 and f11. When I want the depth of field difference between my subject and my background or my foreground to be as minimal as possible and in effect have as much of the image in focus or in reasonable focus as possible. And when the amount of blur in the outer focus elements is realistic for the scene. You're wondering, wait a minute, you've just repeated yourself? I have, and let me explain why. I will now show you two images, both taken in Lisbon from the tourist boat, with the bridge being in the background and actually the bridge being the subject, and a person or a couple of people in the foreground being the outer focus, let's say foreground elements, to add a bit of depth to the image. The first photo was taken wide open, which on my lens was at f2, and the second photo was taken stop down to f8. I'll now give you a few seconds to look at the images and tell me in the comments which one you think looks better to you, which one looks more natural, more pleasing, and generally which you prefer. Not the image as a photograph, but specifically the difference between what's in focus and what's out of focus. Obviously, right now, I can't read your comments because I'm still filming, but when I do, I would imagine that many of you would prefer the f8 image like I do, because the difference between what's in focus and what's out of focus is a lot more realistic compared to the f2 image. The image that's shot at f2 looks really jarring. The difference between the out of focus element just completely looks out of place for the location and the context of what's going on. Whereas the f8 image looks a lot more realistic in terms of what your eyes would see. And certainly, if I remember, because it wasn't that long ago, being there and looking at the bridge with my own eyes, what was out of focus in my peripheral vision was definitely not that out of focus. So this goes to show that sometimes, even if you want things out of focus in your photo, having them too out of focus, as in shooting at f1.4 or f2, will actually be complete overkill. Now, obviously, this is specific to this particular situation, this particular scene, this particular light. If you go somewhere that may be a bit more open, or the distance between your subjects, your foregrounds and your backgrounds is different, then maybe you will have to stop down or even open the lens up too wide open to get the same realistic sort of look. Just because you can shoot at f1.4 on your lens doesn't mean you need to superglue your lens and leave it at f1.4. Utilize all the other aperture values because they are there for a reason. At this point, I want to say a huge thank you to the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. I've personally used their services way before I even opened a YouTube account, and honestly, for me, it's the central hub for everything I do photography related. And today I'm going to touch on the ability to make your own portfolio, be it using their portfolios setup or just having a blank page and setting it up however you want using their galleries feature, which is what I've personally done on my homepage. Now, as you know, certain social media platforms are always changing, so the way you present your work and how other people see your work is completely out of your control. However, if you have your own little corner of the internet, you can effectively completely control how your photos are perceived, in what order they are perceived, and no one else can touch it or mess with it. Personally, I think social media is great. However, having a central location that you can send people to, especially if you're trying to make money from photography, is very important. So if you haven't got your online portfolio, I do highly recommend checking out Squarespace and putting something together that you can send people to, and even for you to look at further down the line as your skills increase and as your portfolio and your photography gets better and you want to present your work in the best possible way. So if this is something that you're interested in, please click the link down in the description. I also want to thank you by watching this portion of the video, because by supporting my sponsors, you support me, so thank you. To be honest, I would say this is by far the smallest mistake you can make in this video. However, I do think that having a go-to focal length that you know inside out, that you're the most comfortable with and you can pick up and use for any scenario is really worthwhile having, and not having that can sometimes hold you back and slow you down. Out of all my primes, the 35mm or maybe soon 33mm is my go-to lens that I literally know inside out. I can use it in any scenario, for street photography, for portraiture. I can even use it in nature if I have to, or even for cityscapes. Sure, it has its limitations, especially with the latter examples, but I am so comfortable with that focal length, I know I can make it work almost anywhere. Finally, this is the lens that I use to hone my skills as a photographer, and I want to get to a position where I am pretty much an expert with that focal length. So you can put me in any situation and I can come away with images that are really, really good just with 35 or soon to be 33 mil maybe. The obvious question is, how does one sound really posh, how does someone find out what their favorite focal length is? Honestly, trial and error. You use a bunch of different primes, you'll gravitate more to some of them, you'll gravitate less to the others, or if you're using a zoom, as I've done a video about it probably a few months ago, you'll figure out, well, between 16 and 55 mil, I actually prefer to shoot between, I don't know, 28 and 40. Pick a middle, that's 35. So that's how you'll basically find out. Obviously, take this point with a huge dose of common sense. Just because you shoot only on the 23 mil doesn't mean you should never try and practice with something wider or something tighter, because there'll be certain scenarios where you need to go wide, certain scenarios where you need to go tighter, and having practice with those two extremes, or just other focal lengths in general, will elevate your overall skills as a photographer. I saved the best to last, and this is the very mistake that I made in Lisbon a few weeks ago that frustrated me so much that I've changed my entire approach to how I use prime lenses going forward. If we backtrack a little, whenever I made videos about what's in my bag or what's my daily carry or what's my kind of go-to street photography setup, it's always been an X-T3 or an X-T4 with the 23 and the 50, or the 23, 35 and the 50 primes. This will now change for good. Over the last 2 years, because, you know, we've been stuck in one place, I've become so used to shooting around London that I know which prime lens I need for which part of town to get the most out of it. So if I'm walking through Bank and then going to Shoreditch and then going to, I don't know, Tower Bridge, right? Then I will bring with me the 35, the 23 and the 50, because I know that at this point I will use the 50, at this point I will use the 23. So at each given point I will only really have one prime and I will not think about the others. However, in Lisbon, because I was in a completely new environment, I was looking at all the different compositions that fitted within the range that I had in my bag, which was between 23 and 50. So if I took a photo at 23 mil, I would then see a composition at 50 mil, and I'll quickly have to change primes. As a matter of fact, I change primes so much, I'm talking like every 10-20 minutes, that in the end I took all the caps off and just left them off all day and just had the primes in my bag without the caps, because that slowed me down changing them. I know it sounds stupid, and it is stupid. However, you might say, well, why did you not look at compositions at 200 mil away? And believe me, there are so many compositions in Lisbon for a 70 to 200, it's ridiculous, but I digress. Well, the main reason for it is because I didn't have a 200 mil lens with me. If I did, I'll be looking at 200 mil. And a lot of it happens subconsciously. If you know that you have the kit on you to reach that far, you will be looking that far whether you want to or not. Whereas if you're just stuck with a 23 mil lens, you are literally just looking at what's in front of you and that's it. So in effect, I was treating these three primes as one awkward, convoluted zoom lens, which had to be changed every 10 seconds. And as you can imagine, this is a recipe for disaster. Not only was it frustrating, not only did I increase the risk of damaging my primes or dropping them because I was doing it in a rush, not only did it mean missing shots, but the main issue of this is that I was always preoccupied with thinking, what prime do I need to have on this camera for this location, rather than looking at the location and thinking, what can I get in this particular scene. So my point of this mistake is, when you go out with primes, take just one prime with you, because that will free you up so much. Honestly, you will feel a lot more free with one prime than you would with 2 or 3 primes, even though at the time of packing your bag, you think by having more primes, it just opens up more opportunities. It doesn't. It actually just messes up your mind with regards to what you look at, and you spend most of your time changing lenses, at least I did anyway. So from this point onwards, I will either go out with a 23 and that's it, or 35 and that's it, or the 50 and that's it. I will never take all 3 or even 2 of them with me at the same time. And if I do think, well, I need the 23N50, I will leave all the primes at home and I will bring with me the 16-55 zoom instead. Okay, that is all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some value out of it. If you have, leave your feedback down below. I'll be reading as well to see what you think about the example with the photos that we've spoken about earlier. Obviously, if you have your own suggestions or thoughts on this topic, please add it into the discussion below. Thank you as ever for watching the video. I hope you're doing well. Have a good week, have a good day, and I'll see you and speak to you in the next video. Bye.